Hello and welcome to this Petri Real Field story where we'll be talking to the founders of the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, HIP, which runs December 1st and 2nd. My name is Russell Smith and I'm editorial director of the Petri IT Knowledge Base. And from Semperis, we have Michele Crocket, who's Senior Director of Product Marketing. We have Gil Kirkpatrick, Chief Architect and Microsoft MVP, and Chief Technologist Guido Grillenmeier. HIP is the premier educational forum for IT pros tasked with managing identity and securing hybrid cloud environments. As the global health pandemic and move to digitalization change the way enterprises work, HIP helps IT pros to learn and implement technology that mitigates new business risks. The conference was voted best in the 2020 and 2021 Globee Awards and the Cybersecurity Excellence Awards and IT World Awards in 2020. Although HIP has been virtual since last year, it attracts speakers from C-level executives to some of the best-known technologists in the industry. So, welcome Guido and Gil and Michele, and I'd like to ask you first of all, why a conference on hybrid identity protection and what need does it fill?
So just to start, there was a new report from Gartner earlier this fall that looked at the use of Active Directory in environments these days, and the analysts predicted that even by 2025, only 3% of companies will be fully in the cloud, fully using Azure AD for authentication. So we know that we're in a hybrid world for some time, and not only is managing security for on-premises AD difficult, but when you add Azure AD to that, it just compounds the risk and the challenges. So having this conference focused on hybrid identity really helps the community grapple with those problems. Guido, anything you'd like to add to that as a long-time HIP conference program director and speaker?
I think that statement is obviously true, especially for the large companies that have an investment that they have put into their business applications, their line of business applications that totally depend on their on-prem Active Directory for years to come. So it's not so easy to just switch out one directory with another one, moving your on-prem stuff all into the cloud. So that's the core reason. It's all about the applications. It's the dependencies of Active Directory or of the enterprises on Active Directory that'll keep them in this hybrid mode for years to come. Smaller companies will be faster to adopt a cloud-only path, but larger companies will, yeah, I guess that 3% is quite applicable for those.
Yeah. Anything to add there?
Anything to add?
Yeah, so from my perspective, the move to the cloud has really enhanced the requirements around security. I mean, security is top of mind for everybody right now because we've essentially opened up our computing infrastructure to the public internet. And it's a bit of a trope, but identity is the new perimeter. You know, that is the way you control access to your resources. And in essentially all enterprises, identity starts with Active Directory and it branches out into Azure Active Directory or Okta or something like that. So this hybrid identity service that enterprises are now grappling with is the way they control security in their environment. That's the basic.
Okay, so thanks. Could you tell me what the focus of the first HIP conference was and how that's changed in the last 3 years?
I think that's a great. So Gil or Guido, were you both in on the first one? Why don't you, one of you, kind of take us back to the future and.
So the focus has
Gil, because I was a participant at that conference and loved all of it, and Gil was a key member to actually have a keynote to open the conference. So that was an important step for that conference.
So the focus really hasn't changed. from its inception. I mean, the whole idea was to bring together the best minds in the Microsoft identity space, starting with Active Directory and sort of branching out from there to other hybrid technologies. And it was, the goal was to make it very technical and with no marketing or anything like that, and basically to have the smartest minds in the room at the same time, exchanging war stories, passing tribal knowledge, learning tips and tricks, all of that to bring people up to speed on how to operate this new hybrid identity environment. HIP inherits a lot of its DNA from the original Directory Experts Conference, which we started, I think, in 2001 when I was at NetPro, and became a very highly regarded technology conference in the Microsoft space. And a lot of those same concepts from the Directory Experts Conference are now in the Hybrid Identity Conference. But the landscape has changed quite a bit. So we're not just focused on the on-prem IT infrastructure as we were back then. We have to incorporate all of the new cloud infrastructure services that organizations use from Microsoft or Okta or Google or other companies like that, and also get in many cases, the guys who are managing the AD infrastructure on-prem are now responsible for integrating this new cloud technology and getting them up to speed on the bits and bytes of OAuth and OpenID Connect and how authentication and authorization happens in a hybrid environment versus what used to happen in the on-prem environment is really, really important. And so that basically educating the technologists in enterprises was the original goal, and it's still the same goal, but the landscape has expanded quite a bit.
And we might want to add that HIP, as the name implies, is specifically for the hybrid identity, which was in place back at the first HIP in 2017. But like Gil just mentioned, the originating Directory Experts Conference was born in a non-cloud world, right, where on-prem identity was the only one that existed. So that's, of course, changed over the years. And so this conference has adapted to exactly that need of enterprises today.
And of course, we've had a couple of conferences that were in person. This is now virtual for the time being, but we do have a great platform that's fairly interactive. There's a lot of opportunity for a chat and to meet up with other people in the conference in virtual networking sessions. So that's a change that we've all gotten used to in the last couple of years, is doing things virtually. But
yep, sure. So looking at the program for the conference in December, it looks like there's a big focus on Active Directory and Azure AD. So why is that exactly?
Yeah, so we do focus on Active Directory a lot, primarily because most businesses do as well. For 90% of mid-sized and large businesses worldwide, Active Directory is the primary identity store. And not only that, it's a primary attack vector for cyber criminals. In fact, Bandiat researchers, I think it was last spring, said that in 90% of the breaches that they investigate, Active Directory is a factor in some way, shape, or form. And we've really seen, I think, since this fall, this just upswelling of publicity and awareness about Active Directory as an attack vector. I think that it's Enterprise Management Associates just came out with a new report, 451 Research. Gartner took another look at it. So I think it's just every attack that you hear of, if you dig deep enough, there's almost always some tie to AD or at least stolen credentials or something. So Gil, anything you want to add to that?
No, you covered it really well, Michelle. It's, Active Directory is a critical component in your security posture, and it is a vector for most cyber attacks. So Active Directory, and like you said, 90% of the organizations are still using Active Directory for their primary authentication. And that's going to be the case for a long time. And we like to think that moving our workloads into the cloud makes things more secure, and in some ways it does. But in other ways, it also opens up the door for more creative kinds of attacks as well, and increases the attack surface area So, that I think really kind of outlines why we focus on the on-prem Active Directory and the cloud Azure Active Directory, or whatever other cloud authentication scheme you might have.
And hybrid is basically about connecting the two. That's what hybrid is. Companies are synchronizing their on-prem accounts into the cloud, into Azure AD primarily. And that basically, depending on how you do that, makes your cloud systems just as vulnerable. Think about a wrong configuration and adding a privileged user from your on-prem AD as a privileged account in your Azure AD. That's something that people need to be made aware of. That's something that the conference will discuss. Why are those attack vectors that are real? The same way, the other way around, attacking your on-prem environment through the cloud. Those are all topics that we're going to be discussing at the conference.
Right.
Okay, great. So the conference seems to be loosely based around before, during, and after phases of a cyber attack. But what are some of the practical things that IT pros will get in each of those areas from HIP 2021?
So I'll just speak a little bit to some of the sessions that we have with those practical tips. First of all, we've got Darren Morelia, who's our VP of Products, and he's doing just that, practical tips for preventing attacks on AD. But then we've got a couple of really interesting sessions, one with Sean Doobie and Alexandra Weaver, where they're looking at account security. We have a free tool called Purple Knight that people can run and do a security assessment. We found out that some of the lowest scores were in account security. So they're gonna walk through the top 5 account security misconfigurations and show how to fix those. And then another interesting session is our Ron Harrell, who is the senior security product manager at Semperis, and Tammy Mindel on his team are going to look at attack paths of AD the AD infrastructure category. So they'll be looking at how attackers see AD and what paths they choose to get into your environment. And then we've got a couple of others. Oren Thomas is also going to look at some of the common misconfigurations. And Guido, it might be interesting because you've certainly been on the scene lately of some companies that have suffered breaches because of misconfigurations, and you probably have some light to shed on that as well, and how really cyber criminals are using some of the same paths that have been successful in the past. They just keep using them because they keep working.
Absolutely. I think we're not going to go down giving the details of the different attack paths right here and now. It's just too much information to share. But the reality is it does repeat all over the place. And even the cyber criminals share expertise. And that's exactly what we need to do on the inside for protecting our own environment as well. And that is exactly what such a conference does. We've got experts around the globe coming together to actually go into those details, sharing their experience on how best to protect the environment, on how to lock down your Azure AD. Azure AD is new to many folks, like Gil already mentioned, that are coming from the on-prem Active Directory environment. That doesn't mean that on-prem is always configured correctly, the so-called Active Directory domain services. We are going to shine and help customers understand what are those things they should try to prevent. What is a good way to delegate permissions? How do you actually implement a least privilege model, both in the cloud and on-prem, to avoid the breaches that intruders would be using to gain access to your environment? Because that's the key thing. There's a lovely saying of the CISO of Microsoft. He likes to say, hackers don't break in, they log in. So it's all about protecting those identities that somebody who has reaped an identity is not able to take it further, to elevate their privileges and then get to the basically the real business not the credentials, the real business data, the crown jewels of the company. It's not AD. AD is the crown jewels from your identity perspective, but for a company, it's their business data, their customer data, their research data that needs to be protected, and that starts with identity protection.
Yeah, and on the recovery front, being able to quickly recover after a cyber attack, of course, is it's vital to keeping the business running, keeping business operations up. And George De Almeida has a session on that. Gil, I think you're moderating that session. Do you have some highlights from that you could share?
So one of the things we've found in our customer interactions and some of the research we've done is that most organizations are very ill prepared to recover their Active Directory from a cyber attack. Maybe they've got some snapshots of their domain controllers or some backups or something like that. But, where that might have worked 10, 15 years ago because, a data center burned down or something like that, doesn't work well in recovering from a cyber attack, where you literally have to start from zero. You have to start with fresh operating systems and a known good backup for each of the domains in your Active Directory environment. And that recovery process is really complicated. It's surprisingly complicated. It hasn't really improved any since Guido and I started working with it 15 years ago. So George's session is going to go through all of the ins and outs of that process and show how you can automate parts of it using PowerShell scripts. And I think that will give people, one, an appreciation for how complex the recovery process actually is, and give them some reasons to go back to their organization and say, hey, we really need to rethink our Active Directory recovery plans, because what we have in place right now is completely insufficient. And it'll give them some tools and ideas about how to improve the reliability and the speed of their recovery after an attack.
Okay, great. So some of the content at the conference is about quite forward-looking technology, things like verifiable credentials and maybe going passwordless. So what can attendees take from those sessions, and what can they actually use right now?
Guido, do you want to talk about John's session on verifiable
credentials? Absolutely, my pleasure.
Start that over.
I've been working on this topic with John for quite a bit. We've also had that topic earlier this year for our HIP Europe conference, and the whole verifiable credential topic is new, and Microsoft is also investing a lot of resources into research on this. It's basically what about an idea to get rid of a central identifier, like a central repository of your identities, such as Active Directory itself or Azure AD itself, where your key, let's say, verifier would be stored on a blockchain. Yeah, basically, if you so want, publicly available credentials that you, of course, need to then authenticate against to verify yourself against some other system that wants to consume that. So it literally is an outlook into the future of identities, trying to get away from everything centralized. We can easily highlight the issue with some of that centralization by the recent Facebook outage that happened, where for some it was just a bad day, not being able to do WhatsApp and Facebook privately and whatnot. Other businesses are using Facebook as an identity provider, and it is at that a central identity provider, and DNS configurations made all those identity inaccessible for use during businesses that actually use those Facebook credentials for their services. So that was a direct impact of a very centralized identity provider to the business, and verifiable credentials would try to mitigate that by basically using standards for that whole authentication process. And John is doing a great session on what's that based on, how OAuth and OpenID have evolved to actually make this a topic, and how verifiable credentials, which problems are solved with that. It won't solve everything, but it'll be very interesting for quite a few scenarios, and that session will explain them.
Okay.
Gil, do you want to talk a little bit about the passwordless sessions that we have, and maybe touch on Jim Rao's session on behavioral authentication?
Sure. So we always like to have, the bulk of HIP is very practical and things you can take home and use today. But we always like to have at least 2 or 3 sessions on futures, so people can start thinking about what that might mean to their organizations, and if they need to start planning, or at least reading up on the new upcoming technology to be ready for it. And the idea of passwordless authentication has been floating around for several years now. The leading technology is something called FIDO2, which is actually integrated into Microsoft Windows Hello and into Azure Active Directory as a way of authenticating. So you can literally authenticate to most of your applications without knowing a password at all, in a very, very secure way. Moving to that kind of infrastructure, though, is especially for a large enterprise, is a non-trivial process, right? And Joe Kaplan has been working on this for at least a couple of years now, and is going to update us all on the progress that his organization has made to going to all passwordless. And then Jim's session on behavioral-based authentication. This is another very future-looking session to look at other ways that you might authenticate people that isn't, say, a biometric or a password or something like that. And this relies on monitoring people's online behavior and building models of it, and seeing where the way they authenticate and the way they access different services changes over time. And if there's some substantial deviation of the way they're accessing resources in the organization, then maybe that's a time to flag that and get some more authentication data, or indicate that there might be an attack in progress. And it fits very well into that whole before, during, and after model that, Russell, you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. How do you detect that an attack is occurring, and what do you do about it when it happens? And behavioral-based authentication factors into that really nicely.
Okay, thank you. The panel discussion on uniting identity and security teams to address security problems, what was the impetus behind that, and do these teams, do they need to be united?
Yeah, some of the observations that we found just working with customers, and also IDSA just came out with a survey that focused on this as well, does point out that there's a disconnect between the identity team, or especially in a small shop, maybe the IT person who's in charge of AD, and the security people. AD is a huge attack vector, but that's not often received a lot of focus from the security team. So over time, we see the conversation starting to open up between these two teams, and the structure of organizations in some cases is changing so that these teams work more closely together. And in some conversations I've had with customers, literally the security person would say, it's great to have an indication of where we're weak on the AD side, because I can go tell that IT administrator whose fault it is how to fix it. And the IT person is saying, finally, I've got some evidence out there in the industry that AD is a problem, and I can take that to the security team and maybe get more resources. So I do feel like this is a conversation that people are starting to have, and these teams are coming together a little bit more. I don't know if you've seen that in organizations where you've been doing incident response or just working with customers as well.
I'm not sure you saw me smile just with the statements that you've made. It's truly just that often Active Directory is seen as an infrastructure service. It's
Sure.
where you add your workstations to, you add your service to, and so that what makes them a unity for authentication. But of course, everybody knows that accounts and passwords are also stored in there, but it's not seen as the system that's added into the security landscape that much. The SOC teams, they are responsible to check event logs on all sorts of systems to see, if anything is going is problematic, if anything is being attacked, if somebody's trying to get in, running some malware and whatnot. And it is evolving sort of as we speak. It is evolving the last couple of years a little bit, but they're often still separate teams, yeah? And they do need to get together more. And we're definitely going to make that a topic at the conference to raise the awareness of that necessity that identity teams and security teams, they must work more closely together. We often have the topic of, the security guys, they want better auditing capabilities, but the AD guys, they're not involved in tool choices of actually doing good auditing for Active Directory, where they know how Active Directory works and what might be best for them to utilize. And so there's still in larger companies a bigger gap. Smaller companies, it's the same guy. Yeah, so he'll be able to bridge that gap himself.
Yeah, and CISOs are getting more involved too, which is helping the situation. That was another bit of research that IDSA uncovered. And the more the CISOs are involved in this conversation, the better the security posture.
Agree.
Yeah. There's no question, identity really is just a component of the security landscape. And whereas we used to think of Active Directory, like you said, Guido, as sort of an operational issue, it's now really primarily a security product, and people have to think of it that way and reorganize around that realization that it is a core component of their security posture.
Right.
Agreed.
Yep. So how do you see the conference evolving over time? So if you look at the threat landscape, what will identity management, security, and IT pros need to be looking out for to adequately protect their environments?
We recently had a conversation with Guido and Gil and a few other people from the organization, and I think one of the points that emerged was that sophisticated attacks will come from unsophisticated attackers. And I think that was an interesting point, because I feel like the groups, ransomware as a service groups, are just going to become more prevalent. They've got great tools at their disposal. And I think it gives organizations a bit of a feeling of futility. You know, it's really hard to fight against these guys. And I think it's really important for our conference to underline that there's a lot of ways that you can close those security gaps, and at the very beginning. So obviously, you know, focusing on prevention is a great place to start. And hopefully our conference can bring some of that to people. So Gil, what would you see in the coming years with HIB?
Yeah, I think over the next, 3-4 years, it's going to be, unfortunately, more of the same. It's a cat and mouse game between enterprises and the bad guys. But over time, especially as we see things like passwordless authentication becoming more prevalent, I think that's going to tend to change the dynamics of the environment. I don't know how, but I think it will definitely change things. But for the immediate future, the next several years, it's really going to be for the conference about educating people about how do you secure your environment, how do you monitor your environment for intrusion to know when something's happening, how do you respond to those intrusions, and how do you recover from the damage. That's really the whole story, and it's going to be that way for the next several years, I think.
Yeah.
Let's add to that what we're advising companies in many of the webinars that we've been doing in the past and will continue to do there's a lot that you can prevent by simply sticking to good basics. Yeah, basics that increase the security of your environments. There are basic guidelines to follow that increase the security, and eventually with that decrease the attack surface in both the on-prem Active Directory environment and Azure AD. And it's really about knowing about those key concepts and best practices. And that's what these conferences share, with the experts joining, and those best practices, they evolve. Yeah. So a conference is not a one-time thing. It's basically something that also the participants will then revisit next year. What's changed? What are the new learnings? What new roles have been made available in Azure, as an example, to maybe mitigate assigning too many permissions to your users that you might have done previously. So there are best practice to be shared, and conferences like HIP is just perfect to learn about them.
Yeah, I'll add that we do have all of our sessions from past conferences online, so they're saved out as separate videos. And we also have a Slack channel, so anyone who comes to a HIP conference can jump on that Slack channel, and we do share updates over time. People can post questions.
And Guido, you brought up a good point, is even though the basic strategies are the same, the details change from month to month and year to year, and this is a great forum for learning what are the improved, better ways for securing your infrastructure and monitoring it and recovering it. That's a good point.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank our speakers today, so Gil, Guido, and Michele. If you'd like more information on the upcoming HIP conference or to register, you'll find a link to the conference page in the description below. And that's it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Russell.
Thanks, Russell.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.